Welcome back to Wrong Sports, as I am back with another college football first episode. And you know that college football is all over television right now, with games starting at noon and going all the way until the early morning hours of Sunday. And from the beginning of college football, there was always someone or some business that was trying to spread the game. In this episode, I'm going to be going over the rise of college football on radio and TV and how it got started and some of the earliest broadcasted games in college football history. But before I get to that, make sure as always you go down below and subscribe to the channel, and of course ring the bell so you can get updates on brand new videos and anything else that's going on this channel. And you can also help out the channel on my Patreon. You can also check out my podcast and my social media in the description below. And of course, like and share this video with other college football fans. From when college football started in 1869 until the 20th century started, college football grew all over the country, as there was now more than 80 colleges playing all over the country. But the only way you could know what your favorite team or your alma mater was up to was to go to the game or read the newspaper the day or the week after. But with more new technologies created in the early 1900s, college football would take the initiative and grow with it. The first way that colleges tried to expand college football and get their game out to more people was to use the telegraph. And the first game to be broadcasted of sorts was the 1911 Kansas-Missouri game. And the reason for this game being important was, of course, because these two teams were huge rivals, but also because this game was the first ever homecoming game. Homecoming was a new thing in America, with schools in the South and the Southwest doing some form of the event, but the name homecoming would come from this game. That was because this series, the Kansas-Missouri series, was being played on neutral sites, but this year's game would be played on the campus in Missouri. With the game now coming to campus, Missouri's athletic director had to find a way to get more fans to come to the game. So he invited alumni to come home for the game. But he would also add in more celebrations to the game, like parades and bonfires. And when word got out, it drew a lot of alumni to the campus, as 10,000 people would show up for the game, which was one of the largest crowds at the time. But for the people in Lawrence, Kansas wanting to root on their team, they had to find another way to find out what was going on. So instead, what they set up was a board of the football field with a football that would be moved back and forth with the game and change colors based on which team had the ball. Along with that, there would also be people who would basically be playing out the game, reenacting the game of sorts, in front of the 1,000 people that showed up in downtown Lawrence, Kansas to watch this board and makeshift game happening. The reason why this could happen was because of a Western Union telegraph wire from Missouri. And this was basically a very, very early form of any sports app on your phone and on your computer that gives you play-by-play results, except obviously there were people reenacting the game, which is kind of cool. But I'm using this game because it was technically the first college football game that was broadcasted outside of where it was being played, since it was being played in Missouri, but the people in Lawrence, Kansas still ended up finding out what was going on pretty much as the game was going on, which was kind of cool and unheard of at the time. But in less than 10 years, broadcasting would soon evolve from that rudimentary telegraph play-by-play wire. And that next evolution would be radio. With radio being in more than half of American homes and the radio being the entertainment in the house, college football would spread their tentacles there. And to do that, they used the backyard brawl more than 100 years ago. With the backyard brawl being a big game and was always sold out, more fans wanted to know what was going on, not only in Pittsburgh, but also down in Morgantown, West Virginia. So a radio broadcast was introduced. And if you are a radio nerd like me or have worked in radio and you know the history of radio, then you will know that KDKA is a famous radio station in Pittsburgh due to it being one of the first radio stations to broadcast in the country and is still around to this day. But KDKA was still in its infancy in 1921, but it had a very strong signal that was able to broadcast all over Pittsburgh and even reach into West Virginia, which was good, since this year's backyard brawl was happening in Pittsburgh, and some people in West Virginia wanted to know what was going on. Now, there were other attempts to broadcast games on radio, but they were mostly on experimental stations, so this was the first time the game was on an actual radio station. KDKA wasn't a licensed radio station yet, as they would become that in December 1921, but they were going through the motions to become that, as the game was broadcasted on October 8th, 1921, and had another first happen during the broadcast, as Westinghouse engineer Harold Arlen became the first ever play-by-play commentator of college football, since the game didn't have anyone to talk about what was going on. They were just going to broadcast it, but you needed someone to explain what was going on, and he was the first ever play-by-play guy. The game was a good one too to kick off the broadcasting of games, because it was a thrilling one as it went back and forth, and was won by Pittsburgh on a last-second kickoff return for a touchdown. After that game, more and more radio broadcasted games would happen locally, but the next step was to nationally broadcast a game, and that would happen only a year later in 1922 with the 1922 Princeton-Chicago game. Now, I talked about this in my discontinued series of Chicago, but I'm going a little bit more in depth on the game right now, and especially the broadcasting of the game. Princeton was 4-0 at this point, and so was Chicago. They were 3-0, so they were both top teams in the nation, and this game was scheduled because they wanted to find out who was the best out of the East and out of the West. And yes, I know Chicago's not out west technically now, but pretty much anything that was west of Pennsylvania was west at this point. And since this was a game between two top teams, and two top teams that everyone knew all across the nation, a lot of people all across the nation wanted to hear it. So to remedy that, they got the game broadcasted from KYW, a Westinghouse radio station in Chicago, and they broadcasted it to WEAF, an American telephone and telegraph station in New York City, and from there to the rest of the country. That's what they had to do pretty much. So this would technically be the first time a college football game, or really any sporting match, could be heard all over the country. And this game was another banger, as Princeton would come out a winner 21-18 and win the national title that year, pretty much off the back of this game. After the next decade or so, college football on radio proved to be a big success, but with the invention of television, it really changed things. And in 1939, television was still very new, as it was shown as a big piece in the 1939 World's Fair. But to see how much TV would improve the college football game, an experiment was done in the first week of 1939. Due to New York City having the most amount of people and the biggest capability to broadcast television, NBC chose Fordham's first game versus Waynesburg College in 1939. The game had NBC broadcast it on their station W2XBS, and it had one camera in the middle of the field, and Bill Stern was the sole announcer for the game. Since television was still very new, and like I mentioned, it was just pretty much introduced to the world at the World's Fair months earlier, estimates are that the broadcast reached approximately 1,000 television sets, but we don't know how many people actually watched it. College football on TV would spread with the second televised college football game just 1 month later, on October 28th, when Kansas State hosted Nebraska for their homecoming contest. But once they started to broadcast games on television, it would spread all across the nation, and it would get really big. So big that the University of Pennsylvania would make a huge decision to broadcast their entire 1940 college football season on television. This decision would also spread to Notre Dame, and this would eventually bring on a huge lawsuit that would forever change the broadcasting of college football for the next few decades. But I won't be going over that in this episode. I will be going over that in a future episode, so don't worry about that. But thank you so much for hanging out with me as I went over the early history of broadcasting college football games in America, whether that means on the telegraph, on the radio, and on television. And I hope you learned a little bit, and if you did, make sure you give a like below to this video, and of course share this video with other college football fans. And if you haven't already subscribed to the channel, please do so. I will have a lot more content coming out throughout the rest of this year, and I'm trying to reach 1,000 subscribers before the end of the year as well. And you can also help out the channel, of course, on my Patreon and my podcast and my social media. You can check out all the links in the description below. But have a fantastic rest of your day.